And there it is. We're back. It's good to see all of you for our webinar. Thank you so much. Hope you had a wonderful holiday last week. As a reminder, White Collar Advice puts on or creates these webinars through our nonprofit, Prison Professors Charitable Corporation. It's really our privilege to support the nonprofit every year through our time, through our money, to bring these resources to you. As I expressed to Chris and everyone, our goal isn't to pitch and sell you and tell you how great we think we are, but rather to help you and provide insights and information that will help you prepare, whether you do some of that work with our team and some do, or if you choose to do it on your own, we give it all away to you to implement. Scotty and I last week were speaking. I think Chris has just joined us. Scotty and I were talking last week like this. I want to change the name of these webinars to a workshop, because we do really engage and it is interactive rather than just having me speak. And another thing, it's great to have this knowledge. We have to apply it. Some do, some don't. We want you to take what we're sharing and implement it. And to that end, I've asked Chris to unmute himself. I see him there on the bottom right. Chris, can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear
Chris,
me?
it's good to see you on the bottom right. You look like a regular person, just like everybody else. We're not taking up the whole screen. This is great. I won't waste time on small talk because we won't have a ton of your time. But everyone, this is my friend, Chris Maloney, a former federal and state probation officer who has agreed to volunteer his time today. Something we speak about ad nauseum, to the point where you probably want to pass out, is understanding the perspective of stakeholders: a judge, a prosecutor, a case manager, a probation officer. Chris has seen it from the other side. So Chris, let's have an interactive discussion today. I'll chime in. People have questions, put them in the chat along the right side. Give us a quick summary as you perceive it, the role of everyone actually, and while we're speaking, everyone, by the way, if you could mute yourselves and carry on conversations and mute yourself, please. Scotty, and if you can mute people as well, if that's happening. Chris, thank you for joining us. We have a lot of people. What is the overarching role of the probation officer?
Sure. Well, I mean, the overarching role is to be the eyes and ears of the court, and you probably have heard that before. Obviously, the case comes under the jurisdiction of the judge. It really doesn't matter if it's federal or state court. And obviously, the judge doesn't have the ability or the time to look into every case individually. So he relies on a probation officer. You know, he or she relies on a probation officer to be those eyes and ears and to funnel information to the court as certain, judicial decisions have to be made.
We talk a lot in our work. We did a webinar recently about persuasion, where we want to persuade people that could persuade a judge. Certainly a probation officer is in a position to persuade a judge in both good and bad ways. There are some lawyers. Nicholas Kaiser, a lawyer from New York, is on this webinar. He is not one of them. He would advise his clients to prepare extensively for the probation interview. Can you talk about the importance of the probation interview that leads to the probation report, and how, in your opinion, someone could begin to prepare for that report properly?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, that's the defendant. You're still a defendant at that time. That's the defendant's turn to be able to communicate to the probation officer just exactly who they are. Take away the offense, take away the person's criminal history. Really, who is this individual? And, I've had my share of judges that I've worked with through the years, and they all really want to know before they get to that critical part of sentencing, who is this individual? Beyond the crime, beyond their criminal history, who is this individual? What struggles they may have, what issues they may have, whether it's mental health, substance abuse, employment, family issues. The judge really wants to have a better understanding of who that individual is. So the more that can be given to the probation officer in terms of information to help them paint that picture for the judge, just puts the judge in a better position to kind of bring the human side of it to sentencing, knowing who this individual is.
So why do you think, in your experience, I believe lawyers have good intentions. They want to help their clients. You were the chief of probation for a long time. You trained probation officers all across the country. No one knows more, in my opinion, about the probation report than you. Why, in your experience, do you think some lawyers dismiss the value of preparing properly for the probation report? In other words, some will say nothing to prepare for. It's a 5-minute interview. Don't stress. Can you touch on that, please?
Sure. Well, if you remember going back 10, 15 years ago, there really was the guidelines controlled everything, at least in the federal system. Unfortunately, you had a guideline range that was driven by the offense and it was driven by the criminal history. there was a little bit of room within that guideline range for the judge to, impose sentence. Since the guidelines have become advisory to a federal judge, there's a lot more room for the judge to kind of take in, once again, the human element. What are some of what they call the 3553, that's 18 USC 3553 factors that the judge can consider that would allow them to go outside of, that calculated guideline range. So once again, 10, 12 years ago, I would agree with a lot of attorneys. There wasn't a lot of wiggle room within the guidelines, but a lot of that has changed. And if you look at the statistics, and, I haven't looked at them recently, but the majority of sentences fall outside of the guideline range in the federal system on the lower side, not on the higher side, due to those 3553 factors, that the court's able to consider.
So everyone, Santos, my partner who runs the nonprofit, interviewed Judge Boo, and Judge Boo said essentially what Chris just said, that you have the guidelines, which are just numbers on a chart, and then you have the factors, the humanity, that is an opportunity for you to mitigate and not just share with the judge, but a probation officer, ways that you may be candidate for leniency. Let's talk about influencing the probation officer, Chris, either at the interview, before, or just after. Our team talks about creating assets with the appropriate message to try to influence this probation report. What sort of assets do you suggest, or the types of messaging that a defendant should convey to a probation officer? Because we frequently say, if you have the wrong message, don't turn anything in. So what are some specific things the defendant can give to the PO to try to influence that recommendation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think back to the reason that you're there, right, for the sentencing. So there's the crime that has taken place, right, that presumably the person's either pled guilty to or been found guilty to. And now the judge wants to get to the who, why, and where. What brought this person to commit this crime? And that could be a lot of different reasons, right? Some people could just be strictly financially motivated, could be substance abuse, all of those different, mental health issues, could be a lot of different things like that. So those are the things that you want to bring to the probation officer, things that you may have been struggling with in life that may have brought you to commit that crime. And the reason you want to bring it to the probation officer, because it'll give the officer time to verify that information. We could all bring a great story to the judge, but unless he has that probation officer to have the time to then go and verify that information, maybe talk to some collateral sources such as family members, maybe a clinician, former employer. So that's really the role of the officer, is to take that information that the attorney thinks, will lead the court towards a variance, but then give the officer enough time to verify it, whether it's through documentation or it's through actually, making contact with collateral sources.
So for a quick note, there are people on this webinar who have been convicted at trial whose lawyers have advised them, don't give anything to the probation officer for fear it could jeopardize their right to an appeal. We had someone in our community, not the most popular person. His name is Scott Tucker. He was in the payday loan industry and had this movie made about him on Netflix. He was on American Greed. The point is, he was convicted at trial. The lawyer said, you can't turn anything in. He did without jeopardizing his right to an appeal. The government asked for 40 years at sentencing. He got 16 years, 6 months, because he influenced his probation officer properly and the judge. You heard Chris say you don't have to get into the offense, whether you've pled guilty or not, but you've got to demonstrate through your own efforts what you've learned. And if you've created victims, Chris, can confirm, if you've created victims, don't they have to be first? Now, my life is imploding. I didn't mean to do it. I didn't have bad intentions. Shouldn't be victims, victims, victims in my plan to make them whole?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And Justin, to that point, and me and you have spoke about this in the past. I obviously totally appreciate the attorney's advice not to talk about the offense, particularly in the pretrial stage. Not as much, obviously, at the pre-sentence stage. But there's a way to separate the offense from just, once again, back to the human part of it. What are those everyday struggles that you're going through that may have led you to this crime, right? That's still kind of sitting out there. It's unadjudicated at that point, right? You haven't pled guilty, you haven't been found guilty, but you might have just day-to-day struggles that you want to start working with, either with the pretrial services officer or demonstrating to the probation officer at the pre-sentence stage that these are some of the things that were going on in my life during the time when this, alleged crime took place.
Let's talk for a moment about some people on our webinar who have had horrific probation interviews. in part because they didn't prepare, they didn't understand the relevance of it. And the report comes back and suffice to say, it ain't great, right? Higher than guideline sentences, no real plan, no follow through, said things in the probation interview, but to your point, there's no follow-up or documentation to prove it. And it could lead, I think, to probation officer to think, like, here you go again. You weren't prepared, or you tell me what I want to hear, and there's no follow-through. Everyone can mute themselves, please, while we're speaking. If someone has that bad probation interview, what are some ways they can overcome a bad probation report?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, typically, in my experience, it's not a one and done. You can have that bad interview, but there should be a dialogue with the probation officer and the defendant, even after that initial, what we call in the federal system, that initial Form 1 interview. The officer should be following back up, should be talking to the individual, maybe requesting more information about a certain issue, maybe employment, criminal history. So the individual has another chance, to kind of try to turn that conversation around a little bit. Let's be honest, there's pressure there with going through that interview, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with the individual circling back to the probation officer and saying, hey, that was pretty intense, being part of that interview. Here, let me try to give you some additional information. Let me try to clarify something that maybe came out. I would hope to be able to say it's just not a one and done. You just don't have that 90-minute interview and then that's it.
So we're going to spend a few more minutes on the probation interview leading up to sentencing. And then I kind of want to work to the end, talk about the impact all the way through the end to supervised release, then work our way back. I'm going to go through a couple of specific questions we're getting, and then we're going to talk about the probation report with its position on sentencing. So Chris, if someone has, let's just say, a probation report that isn't great, that isn't what they would have hoped, and 2, 3, 4 months have gone by, could there be value then, even after the interview, of writing this life story and documenting this journey, progress they're making, and even if several months have gone by, presuming it has the right message, share that with their probation officer. Just send a message. Since I visited with you several months ago, I've continued to do this. I want to share it with you. Can you offer some insights, even post-interview?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. In terms of sharing that information, and also in the federal system, the attorney is going to submit their sentencing memorandum to the court with a copy of it going to the probation department. So that's one more bite at the apple there. And you've already actually seen the pre-sentence, at least the draft pre-sentence report at that time. And if the attorney is looking to maybe clarify some things, or maybe to stress some areas that they really would like the court to consider, it would be in that sentencing memorandum that they could draw attention to the judge to maybe certain things in the pre-sentence report that maybe aren't being kind of cast the way that the individual would like them to be. But yeah, that dialogue with the probation officer is, even after when that initial draft report comes out, when it's the individual's first opportunity to review that report and then provide objections, back to the probation officer, that's the ideal opportunity to then try to redirect that conversation.
So there was someone in our community who had a terrible gambling issue, and due to COVID, his case took several years, and he had the probation interview about 18 months. A big gap went by, and then he updated his probation officer, Chris. I'm going to Gamblers Anonymous. I haven't gambled. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. And he shared that progress with the probation officer, and it really influenced the officer, and it helped at the sentencing hearing because she was able to share this information with the court. Is that what you mean by not just saying it, by sharing the evidence, whether it's I'm getting help with my gambling issue, I'm going to a substance abuse counselor, I'm setting aside money for restitution, I'm working and setting aside some money? Is that the sort of evidence you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. And you bring up a good point, and this is something that, in my work kind of post probation, we've stressed with some of the individuals we've worked with. You don't want to begin that, whether it's now trying to address a gambling issue or whatever it may be, once you pled guilty, right? Because a lot of folks do that, right? Once you plead guilty, then you're trying real quick in those 3 months before sentencing to do some things that the judge will take into consideration. It's ideally during that pretrial stage that you would begin, and once again, keeping the offense separate, right? Not getting into the offense, but what are those positive steps you're making in your life that then you can show the judge, hey, I've been doing this for 18 months, not 3 months, since I pled guilty.
I'm going to touch on that in a moment. Before I do, a couple of questions. Due to COVID and other issues, some sentencing hearings have been 3, 4, 5 years. Sometimes the probation interview could have been done 4 or 5 years earlier than there's a sentencing. Should someone request a new interview or an updated probation report, or just leave it as is if 5 years have gone by? What would you do?
No, absolutely. I would request, and actually not even request that the probation officer should be updating a lot of that information, and asking to have that interview. If it was me, I wouldn't want to be sending a report to the court, that's the information's kind of stale, right? At least the personal characteristics of the individual. We're now talking 4 or 5 years. You should ask if the probation officer is not, is doing the due diligence to go through and update all of that information.
When I met Michael Santos in prison, he encouraged me to do work today that might not help me for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years. I share this because there are people who might prepare, might not influence the probation officer to the degree that they would like, or might not get the recommendation they like. But that doesn't mean that the work they do now can't influence them years down the road. Here's my question. Someone gets sentenced, they have a 3-year sentence, they're going to start supervised release. Am I correct that one of the first things a probation officer will do, I know my PO did, Isaiah Murrow did, good guy. One of the first things they'll do is look at the probation report that could have happened months, years earlier?
Yeah, I mean, that's how the probation officer, you're talking about the supervision officer, right?
Yeah, I shook my probation officer's hand in the halfway house, and I had this record I tried to build in between to influence them, but I know he read my PSR because he told me.
Yeah, that's the first thing you're going to look at. I mean, because there's a lot of information, right? Outside of who that individual is, right? That's very important. But the officer needs to know the criminal history. They need to know the offense, that happened. So there's a lot of information that the officer, really, that's the jumping off point for supervision. First thing you look at.
That's so crucial for everyone because your plea will have the facts, the crime, your conduct. So to the extent that right now you could do work that will influence your probation officer years down the road, you are stronger. Let's also touch on even the work that goes during prison, correct? And let's talk about continuing to build that record because eventually we're going to share with the probation officer. What are some things that someone can do while in custody to continue to build this record to influence their probation officer?
Yeah. Well, one of the things too is anything that you bring up at sentencing, once again, whether it's substance abuse or it's maybe you had employment issues because of lack of training, whatever it may be, the officer is going to know that. They're going to see that. And they're going to want to see that during the term of prison that you try to address some of those factors. Because if you argued for a lenient or sentence because of a substance abuse issue, and then they see during your term incarcerated, you didn't address the substance abuse issue, or, you can follow along with just different things like that. They're going to want to see that you tried to address those issues while you were in custody.
Is it normal for a probation officer to attend the sentencing hearing?
Yes. Oh, yeah. You're talking about the one that wrote the pre-sentence investigation?
Correct.
Oh, yeah. It's mandatory in most districts. The officer has to be there.
And I know some judges really will show some deference and ask. I know Judge Carter here in Santa Ana, I've seen him pause and really rely on the opinion of the probation officer in rendering sentence. Would you agree that many judges really value through sentencing the value of the probation officer who wrote that report?
Well, I will tell you that, in the majority of cases, probably over 90%, the probation officer is submitting a recommendation to the court for sentencing. And that includes the number of months to serve, any special conditions, a fine, restitution. Some districts disclose that to the parties, where others, it's confidential. It just goes to the judge and it's not disclosed. But in probably the vast majority of districts, there is a recommendation from the probation officer that goes to the judge. And don't forget, these are probation officers that are working with these judges on a day-to-day basis that gather kind of the confidence of the judge, over time. And they are giving a lot of, I guess, they're looking at that recommendation closely.
So I attended a sentencing hearing in Boston, your hometown. It was done via Zoom with Judge Gorton, and he commented to the probation officer that the recommendations or report was written differently than others. And I knew that was a good sign because Judge Gorton had seen so many reports from this probation officer that this PO wrote a little different report. prove the defendant had done the work that influenced the probation officer and it ultimately influenced Judge Gorton. So they really know these POs and they get a sense of how well that defendant has prepared.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about sentencing for a moment and the impact the probation report has on programs and designation. I've seen issues where someone in a probation interview mentions they were suicidal at one point. The BOP sends them to a load just to put them in the fences at risk. Talk about the importance of the PSR for programs, prisons, and things like that.
Well, even before the programming piece, the Bureau of Prisons uses the pre-sentence report, to determine someone's classification level. So what type of an institution they will go to. It's one of the pieces of information that they look at during the time that someone's classified. One of the big things to get right in the pre-sentence report is family. I've seen many times where, they don't mention that they have a brother or, a family member that then wants to go visit, the individual at an institution. And that visit is held up for quite a while because there's no reference to the person inside the pre-sentence investigation. Or, maybe there's outstanding child support, or maybe there's issues like that the Bureau of Prisons would want to know about, maybe to help somebody, start tackling some of those issues while they're in prison. But if there's no mention of it in the pre-sentence report, then it either slows down, being able to participate in those type of programs or address those issues, or maybe will preclude them from it because they're just not able to verify it because the probation officer didn't do it.
Understood. Thank you. If you have questions, please ask them along the way or towards the end, the last few minutes. If you put up your hand, I will call on you. Can you confirm something? Is the probation officer on supervised release different from the person who might do the interview? And if they're different people, are they connected and have streamlines of communication, or is it the same person?
Yeah, no, it's typically not the same person, unless, a period of time goes by and when you're released from prison, that person has switched kind of roles within the probation office. But you typically have a group of officers that strictly do the pre-sentence investigations for the court. And then you have a group of what we call post-conviction supervision officers that supervise people when they're released to the community. So it's kind of two different sides of the agency.
Understood. Let's spend a few minutes in prison because there's a lot of people who are going to prison who have loved ones in prison. Your interview with Michael Santos, many people know my partner Michael Santos for 26 years. He had lifetime supervision because of his crime, and he was released from supervision after 1 year. And it was because of the record he built and shared with his probation officer. We don't suggest, Chris, that people overwhelm their probation officer from prison with a letter every day, but I know that I influence my probation officer with some good messaging. Could you talk about the value of sharing some content, maybe it's a release plan or other assets, with your probation officer while you're reaching the end of your federal prison sentence? Would that influence you? Offer some insights on how that could be of value.
Yeah, well, that's a good point because typically the case is not assigned to a probation officer that's going to supervise in the community till maybe about 6 months before release. And when I say release to the halfway house. So about 6 months before the case will get assigned. But everything is electronic now, electronic case files. So if anything is sent into the probation office, it's uploaded into the electronic case file. So if that was me and I was assigned Chris Maloney as a new case, before I went to the halfway house to meet with this individual, I would look at the electronic case file. And if there were letters that were uploaded, if there was any type of information that came in, that would be one of the first things I would be reviewing before I went to the halfway house to meet with this individual.
For everyone listening, what influenced my journey and people in our community's journey, I just didn't send a letter to my PO and say, I've had a good day and how much I ran and I read a good book. That's wasting their time. There's no value. If you're going to create a plan, it has to grow over time. You write something today, 6 months from now, the plan is going to be updated with progress. I was writing about my plans, Chris, upon my release, the business I helped to build. Would you agree or offer some insights on what people should actually share? Programming, education, substance abuse counseling. They're sowing seeds for more liberty on the other side, correct? Offer some insights on what they should be sharing from prison.
Well, you know what? I think you just hit on a good point there. I think one thing to try to be able to show the officer is what your plan, what your goals are, right? And they don't have to be big, lofty goals. What are your goals when you get released? And what are the things that you're doing to make your chances of achieving those goals possible, and what assistance may you need from the probation officer, either while you're still in custody, right, during the halfway house stage, or as soon as you're released. That's the officer's job, is to help that individual be successful. And if you have set up goals, it's pretty clearly articulated to the probation officer, then that officer is going to want to assist. They want to be able to try to get you the resources that you need. And, goals could be housing. You just need stable housing when you're released. Or it could be finding that job. Maybe you just haven't had employment, leading up to your time being incarcerated. You didn't have like a, typical, 40-hour-a-week job, and now that's what you're trying to accomplish. So it's articulating those goals to the officer, but at the same time, during your period of incarceration, what did you do with your time to kind of work towards achieving those goals?
So all of you watching have many opportunities to document your journey. We have Prison Professor Talent, which is free. It costs you nothing. Michael raises money for the nonprofit. We have a team that creates these profiles at no cost to you. I know there are case managers today and probation officers today who review the talent profiles of people they will oversee. They can measure and see your progress. Some case managers have told people in our community, reading your daily journal is one of the highlights of my day. You have impressed me. You should teach a class here in prison to teach other people how to do it. That's how you become extraordinary and compelling through the First Step Act. Can you talk about the First Step Act for a moment? Any changes that you have seen? I think you were involved in a study. And if you have any insights on that before we continue with any more questions, Chris.
Sure. Well, I mentioned to you, I think last week, we had done some work at the Federal Bureau of Prisons on the First Step Act, specifically RNAF, the risk needs part of the First Step Act, where individuals are evaluated once they get to the institution. There's a series of assessments that they go through. One of the things that came out in the study that we were doing, not a large number, but a small percentage of the AICs, adults in custody, didn't participate in some of those assessments. And I think it was just from a lack of knowledge, like what they were all about. And that would preclude them from receiving some of the First Step Back credit for no other reason than they just didn't participate in the assessments. So my suggestion would be, strongly suggest that you participate in all of those assessments, get those done, and then participate in as much programming as you can to start earning, the time off and also the time towards halfway house placement. We really did find during this assessment that we did that the lack of education on the side of the AICs precluded them from participating for no other reason than they just didn't know what it was all about. And if you're not in custody yet, then there's a wealth of information online to bring yourself up to speed so you don't waste any time when you do report to fulfill your sentence, to start taking, part in all of that programming that's going to, in turn, earn you time off.
Chris, a lot of people don't intend to have problems in prison, though they happen. Scotty and I, we get a call every week from someone whose loved one was caught with an iPhone, some problem in prison. Can you talk about how devastating, if at all, one or two disciplinary infractions could be in the level of supervision that a probation officer would offer to someone once they come home?
Yeah, well, the risk assessment that they do when you're in prison is dynamic, as you know. So if you are having infractions while you're in, depending on, how, high your score goes, it might mean that you're going to lose some of that good time credit, or you're not going to be able to earn some of that good time credit. The other thing is when you come out under supervision, it's like anything else. The probation officer has maybe 60, 70 cases that they're supervising. They're going to put all their time and attention after doing their due diligence on the ones that look like they need the most assistance, whether it's assistance or monitoring. The ones that probably have that clean record when they're in the Bureau of Prisons, that have done all the programming, really doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing, that's the one that, lack of a better word, is going to get the least attention, right? Those are the ones that, the officers are going to be focusing somewhere else. So by setting up that record in prison, you're really going to already earn some trust from the officer. When I say trust, that you've already spent a significant amount of time doing the right thing, and maybe the officer's attention is needed somewhere else.
So it's not rocket science. People who in any walk of life who tend to do the work and build a record, they tend to get better outcomes. Sure, it might not influence your probation officer or your judge to the extent that you would like. Someone in our community did a lot of work to influence their prosecutor before signing the plea. It helped a little, not as much as they would like, but it doesn't mean it might not influence your probation officer when you come home from prison. You're coming home, you might as well do the work. You've got to build it, you've got to share it. Let's talk for a minute about, well, quick question. When I was in prison, Chris, a lot of guys would turn down the halfway house because the First Step Act hadn't been passed yet. I've heard from some case managers say, you turn down the halfway house, that's like turning down a program. Would you agree it's not a wise idea to turn down time in the halfway house?
Oh, absolutely. And, and the goal of the halfway house, I mean, granted, I'm going to be honest, there are some issues with halfway houses when it comes to geography. If you're planning on releasing to a certain geographic location, and maybe the closest halfway house is 2.5 hours from there, then some of the value of the halfway house where you're going to get employed and hopefully continue that employment once you're released, that might be an issue. But all other things being equal, that's your time to start addressing some of those obstacles towards reentry, and also be able to gain employment with the assistance of the halfway house staff. Probation will be working with you. We duly supervise the cases with the halfway house once an individual shows up. There's a real reason for that, because the officer needs to build that rapport with the individual when they're in the halfway house, so that when they hit, when they're released, they can hit the ground running. They can continue to work on whatever, goals we've talked about, whatever programming, whether it's substance abuse, mental health, and also employment. The officer's there once again to assist that individual. And that really happens at the halfway house stage. I think it's 6 months before release. The officer will come introduce themselves, and then they'll begin working with the individual, to make that path towards release smooth.
Chris, we saw some changes with COVID, namely more people being able to even work from home on probation, and even while in the halfway house for a little while, working for themselves at home. Some people who had volunteered for our nonprofit, like Scotty and others in our community, their job in the halfway house, they were able to volunteer or work for us. It helped that all of it was documented before prison. I share this because there are so many people, Chris, that go to the halfway house, their job isn't approved. And I think everyone who goes to the halfway house has this feeling, damn, I wish I was back in the cushy minimum security camp. I don't want to be here right now. Can you offer some insights on how to get your job approved, and perhaps types of jobs they will approve, so people can begin to nurture your network, go to the halfway house with jobs lined up, knowing that the halfway house is going to call your employer, tell me about this guy. Let's talk about employment and the best way to get a job lined up.
Yeah, well, and I think you just hit on it there. It's a job that's going to be able to be verifiable, by the halfway house staff. That there is no thought that it might not be legitimate employment, right? That it's a legitimate job. It's there. It's verifiable. It's not one of these jobs where it'll be hard for the halfway house staff to kind of, do any type of tracking on your whereabouts. Some of these, whether it's a sales job or if you were driving, you wanted to drive outside of state, maybe you're going to get your CDL license. The jobs that are easier for them to be able to track the individual, because that's their job, right? That's what they need to do, the halfway house staff, and able to verify and know that it's legitimate employment. Once you can kind of get over those two hurdles, then the rest is just being able to show the halfway house staff that this is a place where they want me to come work there, right? It's not some place where the halfway house staff calls and they really don't even know who this individual is. Maybe they just put the name of the company down on a piece of paper, but no, we have a position for them. It's here and it's verifiable.
I've seen some people lose their jobs because the person who wrote the employment letter wasn't prepared for the phone call, or they start the job, the halfway house will call to confirm you're working. They don't call back quickly enough to confirm that you're working there. The job is denied. And where I was in Hollywood, they'll say it's 8 o'clock. By 5 p.m., come back with at least 20 employment applications filled out. Or the penalty was you would scrub the toilets and showers in that halfway house. They said, you're living here, we're going to get your value out of you. So you've got, to the extent that you can build this record now. I don't like when someone says there's a job waiting for me. The guy goes out of business. The guy's like, look, I don't want these people calling 3 times a day. Sorry. And the guy's like, wow, I have no job. You've got to cultivate it and build it. Now, let's go to a few questions we have here. I have more. Someone said the probation officer was stuck just getting my name spelling correctly. Didn't go beyond asking about and didn't go beyond asking me about my childhood. His report just copies what the prosecutor wrote. It wasn't helpful to me. Any way that I can improve that?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's disappointing to hear. You know, when that, and I assume they're talking about the Form 1 interview for the pre-sentence investigation.
Correct.
Yeah, and that's a publicly available form. If you searched online, you would be able to see all the information that the probation officer is going to ask. You know, getting back to our earlier conversation, it wouldn't hurt either through your attorney or to be able to find that form online, just to prepare yourself for the interview, to know what all those questions are that the officer is going to be asked. You'll just be in a better position to be able to answer them. And to whoever submitted that question, if there are certain things in that instrument that they use for the interview that you don't feel came out in the interview, then I think you mentioned it earlier, Justin, you know, follow up with an email, follow up with a letter to the probation officer covering all of those areas.
I know there sometimes the probation officer will do more work than others, like in any business. Some can be influenced more than others. But Chris said earlier, when you start supervised release, they're going to look at the probation report. So to the extent that you can influence it and build a record over time, you're going to have more liberty. You're going to have more liberty on the other side. We talk about liberty in home confinement. So as you understand it, someone's going to go to the halfway house. Who's responsible, Chris, for getting that person the home confinement, and is the probation officer still as involved during that transition?
No, home confinement, if it's directly from the halfway house, that is under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Prisons, and they have contractors that, you know, provide that service, the home confinement. The only home confinement that the probation office would provide is if it was, say, a split sentence. The judge gave you so many months in custody and so many months on home confinement, that would fall under the probation department. But if the Bureau of Prisons, vis-a-vis the halfway house, is sending you home a few months early, 6 months early, on say electronic monitoring, location monitoring, that's going to be monitored by the halfway house staff.
Excellent. Thank you. If you have questions, by the way, add them here. I'm going to read them or put up your hand. Chris, can you talk about travel on probation? Are you allowed to travel? What are some of the requirements? Does it matter if you owe restitution or you don't? Help us understand the likelihood of traveling both domestic and abroad while on probation.
Sure. So at a high level, domestic travel is approved by the probation officer themselves. International travel can only be approved by the district court judge, and that's through the probation officer. So the individual would make the request to their officer. The officer would submit the request and a recommendation whether the judge should grant it or not grant it. So that's kind of at a high level the mechanics of travel. During the assessment stage, when you first come home from the halfway house, until the officer has the assessment done, there's typically no travel allowed outside of the judicial district. And I know that gets a little complicated in some of these states like California, where, you know, you have one state, but you have multiple jurisdictions within that state. But the officer needs to get that initial case plan done. And then once the initial case plan is done, then they would start entertaining requests for travel. And those could be for work purposes. It could be for vacation purposes. You know, if somebody's all caught up in their restitution and they're fine, and they just want to take their family to the beach for a weekend, then the majority of officers would, you know, approve that type of travel if all of the other conditions of supervision are being met. Now, on the flip side, if you're struggling with some issues, then the reality is they're not going to approve travel outside of the judicial district.
In my case, everyone, I had a probation officer that said, you can travel when it's work related. I had to send a letter. If I had a speaking event, how much I would get paid, how many books I would sell. He said, do not ever bother asking to travel personally. It's not going to happen. And that was fine. That was fine for me. I was grateful that he let me travel across the country to do my job. And I said, I can endure 3 years of not leaving this district for personal reasons. It's fine. Make sure you pay attention to the map, right? Chris, wouldn't you encourage everyone to read their judgment and commitment order? No guns, understand the payment. Just talk about, so many people, once they hear the sentence, they're in such shock. They don't know they've never read their judgment and commitment order. Can you talk about the importance of understanding that? Because it lays out some supervision terms.
Yep. So within that judgment and commitment order, they're going to have what's called the standard conditions of supervision. And those pertain to everybody. Yeah, and I think you mentioned it. You'll not possess a firearm. You'll not be arrested. You'll report to the probation officer as directed. You won't leave the judicial district without approval. So those are kind of the standard conditions of supervision. And then every case has special conditions. Those are imposed by the court. Those are typically your participate in substance abuse counseling. You'll be drug tested, maybe mental health. Um, if you have to serve a period of time on location monitoring, those are all laid out in the special conditions, as well as your fine, special assessment, and restitution are all covered in that form.
Okay. Okay. So I have some more questions on that. Before we do, someone asked, and then Arthur, I'm going to come to your question and some others. The best way to get off supervision early is I know the judge approves it. What are some ways someone can get off supervision early?
Yeah, I mean that's the $1 million question, right? I mean the ways to get off obviously is to be in compliance. To comply with your conditions of supervision. If you do that, most judicial districts you have to serve at least 1 year, under supervision, and you have to have no violations while you're under supervision. So first and foremost is to follow your conditions. The second is, and we talked about it before, is what are those goals that you're setting up, and are you showing your probation officer that you're motivated to achieve those goals aside from being under supervision, right? That's what they want to see, that supervision isn't necessarily needed because you're self-directed, you're self-driven, you want to make some changes to your life, you have goals, and absent supervision, you're still going to be trying to achieve those goals. And that's what you need to be able to show the probation officer. But the biggest thing is, those little infractions when you're under supervision, say you travel outside of the district, forget to tell your probation officer, say, they ask you to come to a meeting and you just don't show up for the meeting. In and of themselves, some of those things are just small things, but they won't help you get off early, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It's similar to some people who are in a position perhaps to pay more restitution. They pay the minimum, and the PO really has to push and fight and beg to get a little money when the person has the resources. We had an issue recently where someone home from prison didn't work. His wife had a very successful career, huge mortgage career, Chris, and he's like, well, I don't have any money. I can't pay restitution. And the probation officer's like, do you think I'm dumb? You live in a home your wife helps support. She pays for your car, your food, your gas, your utilities. Her income can help justify a $500 a month payment. And it just got him off to a terrible start. And it belies this argument that I want to accept responsibility and make my victims whole, right? So you can't, it's this follow through. I need you to stress one more time. If you say you're going to do something, if you tell your PO you're going to do something, isn't it essential you actually do it?
Yeah, 100%. And not only that, is that the officer knows that you want to have, free flowing, information sharing with the officer, conversations. You're going to tell them the things that they need to know. Do you have to tell them everything that's going on in your life? No, not necessarily. The officer's not going to be that intrusive unless, you give them reason to be. But for the most part, if you're keeping them informed, you're letting them know all the things that they need to know to do their job, to adequately supervise you in the community, then you're going to have a much easier time under supervision.
Some people are surprised to learn that they may have fewer restrictions on probation after they've served their sentence than when they were on pretrial. That was the case with me. Arthur in our community wrote, I understand that the probation officer has a supervision plan. Can you get access to that plan, or is this written, or do you need to file a FOIL to get the probation supervisor's reports? In my case, I live in New York and California, and the probation officer protested allowing me to continue to travel, even though I had done that the entire pre-sentencing period.
Yeah, so there's a couple questions there. One in terms of the case plan. I think that's what the individual is talking about. That's supposed to be the I guess policies and procedures in the federal system changed about 15 years ago, that they turned that into a collaborative effort with the officer. So the officers should be sitting down with the individual, and together they're supposed to be coming up with that case plan. So whether it's like freely available, the officers should be talking to the individual about it and understanding what the goals are of that case plan. In terms of the travel piece, that's a hard one to answer, because when you're under pretrial supervision, travel is depending on what the magistrate judge has set as the condition of pretrial release. Some of them might offer you, or not offer, give the ability to travel anywhere in the United States. I've seen that when you're under pretrial, so they don't consider you a risk of flight. Or I've seen others, very everything down to wearing an ankle bracelet, not being able to travel anywhere.
I want to come back. Someone sent me a text message. They didn't want to ask the question. That's fine. They're in our community. They're not working with our team, but they had a probation report that went so poorly, Chris, that the probation officer is like recommending some enhancements for a number of reasons. So these things can happen, right? Like you sit for an interview, you say something, they find something, and just like that, it can lead to a recommendation above the guidelines. Is that common?
Well, I'll be honest with you. The officer shouldn't be recommending an enhancement because they had a bad interview with the individual. Enhancements are grounded in legal issues, right? If you're going to go over and above what the guideline range is, enhancements are, once again, those are driven by statute. They're driven by the guidelines manual. So I wouldn't be worried about it. If you had a bad interview, the officer should not, and the attorney would be able to address it, during the sentencing stage. But to be recommending enhancements, that's really, that's kind of a little bit something different.
Well, I could also say, I think also insinuating it's like you kind of get the 3 points off, but not really accepting responsibility. It's kind of like, I'm sorry, but I something happened, but I had some, and you accept, you say you plead guilty, but you're not really pleading guilty. I think a probation officer can sense if that real remorse is there.
Yeah, and in every district is different when it comes to that. Some judges, just the fact that you, in a timely manner, pled guilty, are willing to give you the full 3 points for acceptance of responsibility, where others really expect the probation office to kind of probe, with the defendant. Are they truly accepting responsibility? My advice has always been to work with your attorney to put something in writing. To put that in writing and to give it to the probation officer. Your attorney's in the best position to know how much information, just to protect you, for any appellate issues, but to be able to submit something to the probation officer that kind of stands alone in terms of accepting responsibility. And I found most officers, once they get something like that, will not continue to probe with the defendant if the attorney provides, their acceptance of responsibility letter.
Don't forget, everyone, Judge Bennett told my partner Michael in a YouTube video he's only sentenced more than 4,000 defendants. He knows other judges would be impressed if a defendant took the time to get their life story and other valuable information to the probation officer for the interview. And if there is more work that's done and documented, you could update that narrative again before sentencing to show the growth. And he also said he would like that a defendant didn't wait until 5 minutes before sentencing to do this work. It would show how proactive they are. If judges and probation officers are telling you to do it, you should probably do it. Let's talk about clarifications and objections to the probation report, Chris. There are actually some defendants who go to an interview without a lawyer. Most go. When the report comes back, like what happens next if a defendant doesn't agree with what's come back?
Yeah, well, the way the procedural order is set out, you get the first draft of the pre-sentence report, and then you're able to file with the probation officer what they call objections. Those objections go to both the probation officer and the U.S. attorney. The one prosecuting the case has not gone to the judge yet. So that goes to the probation office. They have a certain amount of time. It's usually within a few weeks of receiving those objections to then go back and either change the pre-sentence report, kind of agree with the defendant and change the pre-sentence report, to disagree with the defendant and not change the report, but to document it, the reasons why. And then lastly, to kind of tee it up for the judge to decide the issue at sentencing. Maybe it's something that the probation office thinks the court needs to rule on.
Excellent. Someone asked during your PSR, is it okay to have your attorney present? Chris, you need your lawyer there. Chris, don't you agree with that?
100%.
Absolutely, you need your lawyer. There's someone asked about guns. When I send the replay out, there's someone in our community. His name was Greg Reyes. He was the CEO of Brocade Communications, went to prison for 18 months, met Michael there. He actually got his gun rights back in this district. I'll send that ruling out that enabled him as a convicted felon to get his guns back. But it's very difficult and it's few and far between. But when I send the replay out, I will include the ruling on Greg's case that allows him to have guns. Let's see. I'm going through some questions here. Wow, we have a lot. Are there any questions that are coming to mind right now as we get, we're at 1:53 as we get ready to wrap up this interview. Are there any questions I haven't answered, or Chris, as we get ready to wrap up, are there any, I guess, some final thoughts that come to mind as people go through what is a very difficult process going through a government investigation?
Yeah, no, I think the one thing that I would mention from the onset, right? We always say that reentry starts at arrest, right? And you need to start thinking about it that way. The crime aside, what are you doing at that point once you're arrested in terms of your interaction with the pretrial services officer, who once again is the eyes and ears of the magistrate judge that's overseeing your case? You know, how are you interacting with that individual? What information are you giving them? What kind of a relationship are you starting with them that hopefully they can advocate for you too at sentencing? You know, we see that all the time where the pretrial services officer is asked by the district court judge, you know, how was Chris Maloney when he was under pretrial supervision? Was he compliant? Was he not compliant? And that is so powerful to have somebody like the pretrial services officer advocating for you as well.
I believe of the 54 minutes we've been on, that might be, for the pre-sentencing, one of the most important things you've said, because we talk about persuading people that are going to influence how long they'll go to prison, persuading your case manager. If you persuade the case manager properly, it can persuade them to give you more halfway house time. You've got to be creating. But Chris, 2 minutes into our call, said, if you're not doing the work, don't do it. Right? If you're not actually going to follow through on your commitments, don't turn in anything, because then I hate to say it, you look foolish. You say you're going to do something, you don't. You're better off giving them, as we say, because don't give them anything. Let's touch for a minute. If you're in a prison in California, Chris, and you're going to go to a halfway house in Mississippi or something like that, are they going to assign your case to someone and the probation officer? How do they coordinate that amongst releasing to different states?
Yep. So the institution, the federal institution, sends the packet to the local. They call it the CCM's office with the Bureau of Prisons, who then assigns you to the halfway house closest to your home. You know, closest to your home residence. At the same time, the probation office gets notified that, like, Chris Maloney will be arriving at that halfway house at some given period of time, and now you're entered into our system, and now there's a tickler in place, so the officer knows at the 6 month point to make that contact with you at the halfway house.
God, it's fine. I just got a text message from someone that said the PO's coming to my house tomorrow. So that means their loved one's in prison. They have a release date. Can you just spend a minute or two on what that walkthrough is like when they come to the house, and kind of what they're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, they're looking to make sure it's a safe environment, not only for the officer, but for the individual that's going to live there. You know, they want to make sure that they're setting themselves up for success, and they're going to be living in a place that would lead to success. Things like, you know, just very generally, dogs, things like that could create safety concerns for a probation officer showing up at this house. If people are using illegal drugs in the house, you know, that's one thing that the officer is going to be trying to observe and see what type of activities going on at the house. So they're really going there, making sure that this is a place that someone can succeed when they're living there, and also that it's a safe environment.
Well, that's also something you discussed with Michael Santos, where you said that the goal of probation, it's not punitive, isn't it? Rehabilitation to support.
100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, we are protecting the community by statute, and that is the role of the officer. But how we gauge our officers, how we gauge ourselves as a system, is how well we are at having people succeed. we don't pat each other on the back if we're putting people back in prison. Actually, we go back and look at what we're doing, because obviously we're not being successful.
Understood. A couple of more questions here, Chris, then we'll wrap it up. Someone said, my loved one would like to relocate to get away from his former crowd. Are they allowed to relocate while on probation?
100%. Yep. But once again, it's almost, they would have to have a plan that includes a solid residence and employment prospects.
Like everything else, it has to be documented. There has to be a record of why you want to move, where you're going to work, where all of these things are vital.
Yeah. And the receiving jurisdiction wouldn't just accept you because you just want to change the scenery. They would want to know that you have stable housing and that you have a job, you know, there.
Right. Now, a couple more things here. They're coming in. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes. Between the time that I was sentenced and my surrender date, I paid my restitution. How do I show my case manager while serving my sentence that my restitution was paid in full? My check was deposited, but I didn't receive a receipt. He should get a receipt, correct? What would you say?
You should get a receipt, and then the clerk's office where the person was sentenced would also have a record of that as well. So they could either write to the clerk's office or call the clerk's office, and they would know their balance.
And quickly, this comes up every now and again, Chris. You want to have all of your education, including you graduated high school and probation report, because there are some people with PhDs who will get their GED if it's not listed correct. These are little things that could pop up. The report has to be correct, correct?
Yep, 100%. And it gets back to, gaining that trust of your case manager at the institution. If there was something that was inaccurately reported in the probation report, such as education, and then you show up, at the institution and you tell the case manager, no, that's not right, they're going to immediately want to know why you didn't point that out to the probation officer during the pre-sentence stage.
Someone asked a question about opening up brokerage accounts. Send me a personal message and I'll help you, because I was fired from every firm in town and I've been able to find a home. These are the consequences of our conviction. I may have a referral for you. It's 10% chance, but whomever sent that message, you can text me or just email me, respond to the message that came out. I know it's frustrating to get fired from banks. It's part of the process. I guess, Chris, the last thing I want to close on is someone asked more about getting off probation early. Can someone get off early if the probation officer doesn't? Will they come to you first? Are you going to make a recommendation to the judge, like I support it, don't support it, or I have no opinion? And then ultimately it's up to the judge. Go through your process one more time in the approval or denying process.
Yeah, so there's two ways an early termination can happen. One is the probation officer, which is the best way, is you want them to advocate for you and approach the court and recommend it. The other way is to have your attorney petition the court for an early termination. In that case, the judge is going to reach out to the probation office and ask for their recommendation on whether or not there should be an early termination. And you can obviously see that if it comes just directly from the probation office, 9 out of 10 times, the judge is going to approve that and they're going to early terminate the individual.
Okay, this is actually going to be our final question because I've seen it. What are some common probation violations, and which severe ones, besides the obvious ones of guns and committing a new crime, what are some probation violations that could actually get you sent back to the halfway house or prison?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest ones is moving without permission. And we're not talking just moving out of the jurisdiction. Even if you move 3 houses down and you didn't tell the probation officer you were moving, then usually they'll ask for a warrant for your arrest and you'll probably end up back in the halfway house. So it's keeping the probation office, because folks move around a lot, and being able to get on the front of that and be able to get the officer's approval for you to move. So say you're living with your aunt, but you want to move in with your uncle. Make sure you're letting the probation officer know that you want to do that, and they'll investigate it once again, and they'll give you the permission to do it. But if you just do it on your own and then ask for permission afterwards, that's the type of thing that would get you immediately returned, probably to the halfway house, if not the institution.
Chris, we're in California, for example, medical marijuana is allowed, but federally it's not a crime. If someone wanted to smoke on probation, would they need to get permission from their probation officer because they could be tested?
Yeah, well, it's still a federal violation.
Right.
So you would have to get the medical marijuana card. Yep.
Okay, got it. Okay, we are at 2:01. We had great engagement. I'm super thankful that all of you joined us. I'm going to get this replay out with courses that I promise, our probation report course, our release plan course, and they're all going to help you create great stuff that's going to influence stakeholders. Chris, I'm really grateful that you're our friend, my friend, and that you've taken so much time to share your expertise with us today. Both Michael, Scotty, our entire team is really grateful and appreciative. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Okay, guys, I'll get this replay out in a couple of days. Thank you all for your time. Bye-bye.